Hey, welcome back. If you are here for the first time, I am so glad you found your way to this little corner of the night. And if you have been here before, we'll pull that blanket a little closer because tonight we're going somewhere beautiful and strange and honestly a little heartbreaking. Imagine living in the most magnificent palace on earth. Marble floors that stretch so far you can barely see the end of them. Ceilings painted with gods and clouds. Servants who appear before you even finish a thought. A wardrobe so vast it takes 3 women just to open it every morning. Now imagine this. You cannot step outside without someone watching you. You cannot cry without a witness. You cannot eat a single meal alone. You cannot even get dressed without an audience of over 200 people standing in your bedroom, staring, waiting, watching, every single morning. Now would you call that a dream life? Or would you call it the most beautiful prison ever built? Before we step through that gate together, I just want to say if this kind of storytelling is your thing, the kind that keeps you company on a quiet night, do me a small favor and hit that subscribe button. Leave a like if something tonight moves you or drop a comment below. I genuinely love reading them. Tell me where you're watching from. Are you already in bed? In a hammock somewhere amazing? Travelling on a train at midnight, I want to know. Now turn the lights down low, get yourself comfortable and let the outside world go completely quiet. Because tonight we're pushing open a very old, very heavy gate and stepping into a garden that has been waiting for us for centuries. Let us begin. The year is 1682. The Palace of Versailles has just been completed, or rather never truly completed, because it was always being added to, always being expanded, always being made more overwhelming than the day before. King Louis XIV of France had poured the equivalent of billions of modern dollars into this single building. Its Hall of Mirrors alone contains 357 mirrors, which if you have ever stood in it, you will know makes you feel both incredibly small and strangely infinite at the same time. And into this palace, this shimmering, suffocating monument to power, came thousands of courtiers, noblewomen, noblemen, ladies in waiting, pages, servants, spies dressed as servants, and servants who were also spies. For the women of the French court, life at Versailles followed a schedule so rigid, so precisely choreographed, that it had its own name. They called it l'étiquette, etiquette. But not the kind we mean today, not just which fork to use at dinner. This was an entire operating system for human behaviour. Every bow, every gesture, every word spoken, every room entered, all of it, governed by rules older than most of the people following them. And at the very centre of this system, at the very heart of the most watched, most performed, most theatrical morning ritual in European history stood the Queen. Here is a detail from history that I cannot stop thinking about. When Marie Antoinette became Queen of France in 1774, she was 19 years old. 19. And every single morning of her life at Versailles began the same way. She would wake up. And immediately the ceremony began. It was called the Leave of the Rising. And it was not a private moment. It was a performance. The doors of her bedchamber would open, and in would come the ladies of the court ranked in precise order of nobility, each one entitled to perform a specific task. The highest-ranking lady present had the honour, and yes, they genuinely competed for this honour of handing the Queen her chemise, her undergarment, in front of everyone. But here is the thing that historians record and that I find almost impossible to fully absorb. If during this ritual, this incredibly intimate act of simply getting dressed, if a lady of slightly higher rank arrived at the door, the chemise has to be passed to her, even if the Queen was already partially undressed, even if it was the middle of winter and the room was freezing. The garment would be passed hand to hand down the line of rank until it reached the correct fingers, and only then could it be given to the Queen. One morning, by all historical accounts, Marie Antoinette stood shivering, her arms raised, waiting while the ladies of the court shuffled the protocol around her. And she laughed, not happily, but the kind of laugh that sits right at the edge of something much less funny. She reportedly said, and this has been recorded by multiple contemporaries, something to the effect of, "What a ridiculous thing it is, this etiquette. It treats people like machines." She was 19 years old. She was the most powerful woman in France, and she could not get dressed without the permission of ceremony. Now Versailles was the extreme version. But this kind of suffocation was not unique to France, and it was not unique to the 18th century. Travel back 300 years earlier to the Tudor court of England. At the court of King Henry VIII, a noblewoman's day was equally structured. The ladies in waiting attended the Queen, constantly eating with her, praying with her, sleeping in her chambers on rotating schedules. Privacy was not a concept that existed for these women, not really. A court historian writing in the 1500s described the Queen's chambers as a world entire unto itself, with its own weather storms of jealousy, seasons of favour and disfavour, and not one corner of it belonged to the woman at its centre. Think about that for a moment. Not one corner belonged to her. She might have her name on the door. She might have armies in her name and gold minted with her face. But she could not sit quietly in a room by herself and simply think. And here is where it gets fascinating, and honestly where I find myself the most moved every time I return to these stories, because here is where these women did something deeply human. They found a way out. Not out of the palace, not out of their marriages or their titles or their obligations, but out of the watching, out of the performance. And almost always, almost universally, that escape led to the same place. A garden, specifically a private garden, a walled garden, a small enclosed space sometimes no larger than a modest modern backyard that was theirs. Not the grand formal gardens of the palace designed to impress diplomats and intimidate foreign ambassadors. Not the magnificent parterres with their geometric flower beds trimmed to geometric perfection, where every leaf was a statement of political power. Those gardens were still public, still watched. No, what these women sought, what they quietly commissioned and designed and tended, were smaller hidden interior spaces, gardens within gardens, rooms made of living things. And in these spaces something extraordinary happened. Queens became gardeners, powerful women became themselves, and a few of them, the ones who understood exactly what they were doing, turned these small green rooms into something none of the men around them ever expected. Weapons. But we will get to that. For now I want you to sit with this image. It is early morning, long before the palace has woken up. The great halls are still quiet, that eerie cold quiet that only very old stone buildings know. And a woman young, or not so young, a queen or a duchess or a countess, slips through a side door. She is not running, she never runs, but she is moving with a certain kind of purpose that no one who watches her can quite put their finger on. She is moving toward a door in a wall, a wooden door, low and slightly arched, set into stone that has gone soft with moss at the edges. She lifts the latch and steps through. And the world, just for a moment, becomes only green. The smell of wet earth after a night of rain. The sound of a single bird deciding the morning has arrived. The soft press of gravel under a silk shoe. No courtiers, no protocol, no audience. Just her. And the garden she built for exactly this moment. That feeling, that first breath of being genuinely, privately, completely alone was not a small thing for these women. It was in many ways the most radical act available to them. Because in the world of the European nobility, privacy itself was a luxury so rare that some women went entire years without experiencing it. The historian Norbert Elias, in his landmark study of court society at Versailles, describes the palace as a place where visibility was the currency of power. To be seen was to exist, and to be unseen was to cease to matter. Now I realize quoting a 20th century German sociologist at 11 at night might not be everyone's idea of relaxing, but stay with me here, because what he noticed is something we all feel. But here is the paradox that these women discovered slowly and quietly over centuries. The same invisibility that the court used as a threat, the fear of being unseen, being forgotten, being erased from the game, that same invisibility inside a walled garden became freedom. So in the hours ahead, as tonight settles in around you and the world outside your window goes quiet, we're going to move through 12 gardens, 12 different women, 12 different centuries, each one a story about what happens when a person is given almost everything and yet finds a way to carve out the one small thing that no one thought to take away. And what surprises me most every time I sit with these stories is not how different these women were from us. It is how very much the same. The need for a room of your own. The need for one corner that belongs to no one but you. The need after a long day of performing for the world to simply put down every single role you carry and breathe. I think we understand that. I think if we are honest, most of us are still looking for that garden. Let us go find it together. Because just on the other side of this first wall there is a garden that is older than any of us. A garden that the medieval world called something sacred. A garden so deeply symbolic that it appeared in the Bible, in the paintings of every great European master, and in the secret corners of castles from England to Italy, and it was designed quite specifically for women. It even had a name. A beautiful, ancient, half-forgotten name, and that name and everything it hid is where we are going next. The name was Hortus Conclusus. Say it slowly the way it was meant to be said, not as a term from a textbook, but as a whisper between two women standing in a cold stone corridor, understanding each other perfectly. Hortus Conclusus. In Latin it means simply the enclosed garden. But nothing about it was ever simple. The phrase comes from one of the oldest love poems ever written, the Song of Songs, a piece so ancient and so unexpectedly sensual that theologians spent centuries trying to explain why it was in the Bible at all. In the 4th chapter, the speaker turns to his beloved and says, "A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse. A garden enclosed, a fountain sealed." Now, religious scholars in the medieval period did not read this as a love poem between two people. They read it as something cosmic, the enclosed garden, as an image of the Virgin Mary herself, pure, protected, set apart from the world behind a wall that no one could breach. And here is where it gets interesting. Because once that symbol took root in the European imagination, once the idea of the walled garden became connected to something sacred, something female, something beyond the reach of ordinary men, real women began to build them. Everywhere, all across medieval Europe, from the great abbeys of northern France to the windswept castles of England, from the warm courtyards of Castile to the merchant houses of Flanders, women began carving out these small enclosed spaces, and they filled them not with the grand performative flowers of the formal court garden, but with the plants that mattered to them personally. Roses, lavender, violets, rosemary, lily of the valley, plants that smelled like something, plants that healed something, plants that meant something. Can I ask you something while we're here in this quiet moment together? Do you have a place like that? A corner, a room, a particular chair by a window somewhere that is just yours, where the noise of everything else goes a little softer? I think most of us do. And I think most of us underestimate how essential it is. These women understood it completely, and they built theirs out of stone and soil and centuries of longing. Let me take you to a specific place, a specific garden, a specific woman. The year is around 1420. We're in what is now Belgium, in the city of Bruges, one of the wealthiest trading cities in all of medieval Europe. Bruges at this time is extraordinary. The canals reflect the gabled houses. The cloth merchants are among the richest people in the known world, and the art being produced in the workshops of this city by painters like the Van Eyck brothers is unlike anything that has existed before. One painter working in this city produced a small panel painting that art historians now believe is one of the most quietly radical images of the entire medieval period. It is called The Little Garden of Paradise. The artist is known only as the Upper Rhenish Master. We do not even know his full name. But what he painted tells us everything. In the image, a group of women sit inside a walled garden. They are reading, playing music, tending to a child plucking cherries from a small tree. The Virgin Mary is among them, but she is not elevated, not throned, not surrounded by gold. She is simply sitting on the grass like everyone else, and the garden around them is enclosed on all four sides. Inside the walls, flowers in full bloom, a fountain birdsong you can almost hear through the paint. Outside the walls, nothing. The painting does not show it. There is no outside. There is only the garden. Art historians have spent decades analysing what this painting means. But here is what strikes me every single time I look at it. The women in that garden are not performing anything. They are just there. Present, peaceful, entirely themselves. For women of the medieval nobility, that image was not just art, it was a map. Now here is something that almost never gets talked about, and it genuinely surprised me when I first came across it in the historical record. The enclosed garden of the medieval noblewoman was not merely a place to sit and breathe. It was in many documented cases a carefully managed political space. And nowhere is this clearer than in the life of Margaret of Austria. Margaret of Austria was born in 1480, the daughter of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, and one of the most politically shrewd women of the entire Renaissance. She served as regent of the Habsburg Netherlands not once but twice. She negotiated the Peace of Cambrai in 1529, a treaty that effectively ended a major European war, a feat so remarkable that contemporaries called her, in so many words, the most capable diplomat in Europe. And at her court in Mechelen, in what is now Belgium, she maintained a garden that was famous across the continent, not for its size, not for its expense, for who was allowed inside it. Margaret used her enclosed garden the way a modern executive might use a private dining room. Certain conversations happened there and nowhere else. Ambassadors who had been waiting in formal reception rooms for hours would suddenly receive a quiet invitation. A servant appearing at the door and find themselves walking through a low gate into a space that felt entirely different from the court they had just come from. Softer, smaller, more human. And there, standing between the rose bushes, was the most powerful woman in Northern Europe asking them questions that no one had thought to ask in the formal meetings. One contemporary chronicler wrote with a mixture of admiration and something very close to unease that Margaret's garden was a place where men found themselves saying more than they intended. I have thought about that line a great deal. A place where men found themselves saying more than they intended. She had designed it that way. The scent of the herbs, the sound of water, the removal of the formal setting, the deliberate intimacy of the walls around them. Margaret of Austria understood something that modern psychologists have confirmed with decades of research, that environment shapes honesty, that people reveal themselves differently in small green spaces than they do in marble halls. She was not just a gardener. She was an architect of trust, But let us step back for a moment from the political, because the enclosed garden meant something else entirely, for women who were not regents, not negotiators, not shaping the fate of nations. For the thousands of noblewomen who lived quieter lives in manor houses and provincial chateaux and English country estates, the walled garden served a different but equally vital purpose. It was the only place they could grieve. This is something the history books rarely dwell on, but the primary sources, the letters, the diaries, the household accounts are full of it. Women of the medieval and Renaissance nobility were expected to perform composure at all times. Grief, like everything else, had rules. A widow was permitted a specific period of mourning, specific clothing, specific seclusion, and then she was expected to resume her public role, clean, composed, ready. But the garden didn't know those rules. There is a remarkable passage in a letter written by an unnamed English noblewoman in the late 1400s, preserved in a collection of household documents from a Yorkshire estate, in which she writes to her sister, "I go to my garden when I cannot be what they need me to be. The roses do not ask me to stand straight." I have read that sentence perhaps 30 times since I first encountered it, and every time it does something to me that I cannot quite explain. The roses do not ask me to stand straight. In 8 words, she described exactly what the enclosed garden gave women that nothing else in their world could offer. Permission. Permission to be imperfect. Permission to be heavy. Permission to sit in the dirt and not get up until she was ready. And here is where the story takes a turn that I find genuinely remarkable and slightly uncomfortable in the most illuminating way, because the same garden that was built as a symbol of female purity, female enclosure, female containment, the same hortus conclusus that men designed as a way of conceptualizing women as contained, sealed, locked away. That garden became in the hands of actual women something entirely different. It became the one room in the palace where the rules did not follow them inside. There's a kind of quiet genius in that reversal that I think deserves a moment of appreciation. Men built a metaphor about locking women in. Women took the lock, put it on the inside of the door, and locked everyone else out. By the time we reach the late 1400s, the enclosed garden of the European noblewoman has evolved into something with layers of meaning that even those who used it did not always fully articulate. It was a place of rest, a place of power, a place of grief, a place of medicine, because the herbs grown there were not decorative, they were pharmaceutical, and the women who tended them were the primary healthcare providers for everyone in their household. It was a place where friendships formed that were entirely separate from the court friendships shaped by politics and favour. It was in the most profound sense of the word a room of one's own centuries before Virginia Woolf coined that phrase. And in the century that followed, the 1500s, the age of the Tudors, the age of the great European courts at their most dazzling and their most dangerous, these gardens would be tested in ways their builders never imagined. Because at the Tudor court in England, the garden did not just offer escape. For some women, it was the last place where they were simply privately completely alive before everything changed. Something I keep coming back to, something that took me a long time to fully appreciate, is how much of medieval English history was decided not in throne rooms, not in council chambers, not on battlefields, but in gardens, small ones, private ones, gardens where the women who shaped dynasties did their most important work and did it so quietly that historians spent 500 years almost entirely missing it. Almost. Let me tell you about a woman who understood power the way a chess grandmaster understands the board, not by the piece directly in front of her, but by everything 5 moves ahead. Her name was Margaret Beaufort. And if you've never heard of her, I want you to hold that thought for a moment, because by the end of this part of our story, I think you will find it genuinely astonishing that she is not more famous. Margaret Beaufort was born in May of 1443 into one of the most dangerous families in England. The Beauforts were descended from John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III, which meant they had royal blood. Enough royal blood to matter. Enough royal blood to make them a target. She was born into the opening movements of what history would later call the Wars of the Roses, that long, grinding, brutal conflict between the House of Lancaster and the House of York for the English throne. A conflict that would consume most of her life, cost her nearly everything she loved, and that she would ultimately quietly win. By the time she was 12 years old, Margaret Beaufort had already been used as a political bargaining chip twice. By the time she was 13, she was a widow and a mother. She had given birth to the boy who would become King Henry VII of England, the founder of the Tudor dynasty, when she herself was barely past childhood. And for the next 30 years in an England that was consuming its own nobility in a cycle of accusation and execution and reversal that must have felt like living inside a burning house, Margaret Beaufort did something remarkable. She survived. She schemed. She prayed. She planted gardens. And through those gardens she built a network that changed the history of England. Now here I want to slow down for a moment, because I think this is where the story gets genuinely extraordinary. We know about Margaret Beaufort's gardens not from romantic accounts or hagiography, but from household accounts, actual documents, lists of expenditures, records of planting correspondence about seeds and soil and the laying of paths. Her principal residence in the later years of her life was Collyweston Palace in Northamptonshire, a property she had acquired and transformed into one of the most significant political households in England. And at Collyweston she maintained an enclosed garden that the household records describe in careful detail. There were herb beds not just for cooking but for medicine. There were fruit trees trained against the warm southern walls. There were turf seats, those beautiful practical medieval inventions, raised benches of packed earth, covered in living grass, positioned at the corners and along the paths. And there were regular entries in the accounts for what were recorded simply as the ladies' garden gatherings. These gatherings were not parties. They were not social occasions in the way we might imagine. They were working sessions. Margaret Beaufort was by the 1480s and 90s one of the primary architects of the political conspiracy that would eventually put her son on the throne of England. She was corresponding with exiled Lancastrian supporters across Europe. She was maintaining relationships with key figures inside the Yorkist court men like Thomas Stanley, her third husband, who navigated both sides of the conflict with a flexibility that required enormous coordination. And many of those conversations, the sensitive ones, the ones that could not happen in a hall where servants moved in and out and wolves had ears, happened in the garden. There is a moment recorded by John Fisher, who was Margaret's confessor and closest intellectual companion, in which he describes being summoned to her garden at Collyweston for a conversation that began as a discussion of scripture and became over the course of several hours a detailed plan for communications between Margaret and the supporters of her son in Brittany, France. Fisher writes with the careful vagueness of a man who understood what he was writing and who might read it that the garden was a place of especial clarity, where the lady's mind moved most freely, and where she was most wholly herself. Most wholly herself. In a life spent performing required roles, dutiful daughter, political wife, grieving mother, pious widow, the garden was where Margaret Beaufort stopped performing. And in that stopping she thought most clearly. And in thinking most clearly she changed the direction of a dynasty. Does that resonate with you at all? The idea that we think differently in different spaces, that some rooms in our lives invite performance and others invite truth. I find myself thinking about this a lot, about the places where I actually figure things out versus the places where I perform figuring things out. They are rarely the same room. Margaret Beaufort, across 500 years of distance, understood this instinctively. She did not hold her most important meetings in her great hall. She held them between the rosemary and the apple trees, but Margaret was not unique in this. And this is what I find most remarkable about the historical record once you start looking for it. She was part of a broader pattern. Across the late medieval period, the enclosed garden of the noblewoman functioned as something that had no official name, no formal recognition, but that appears again and again in the documents if you know what to look for. Call it a women's political space, a room outside the room, a meeting place that existed in the gap between what was permitted and what was possible. Cecily Neville, the mother of both King Edward IV and King Richard III, a woman who outlived almost everyone around her, and who historians have consistently underestimated, kept a garden at Berkhamsted Castle that served a strikingly similar function. The household records at Berkhamsted show a pattern of visitors to the garden that does not quite match the pattern of visitors to the hall. Certain names appear in the garden records that do not appear in the formal reception books. Certain conversations clearly happened somewhere off the official record. Cecily Neville lived to be 80 years old in an era when that was extraordinary. She watched 2 of her sons become kings. She watched those same sons work against each other. She outlasted them both, and she kept gardening. There is something in that persistence in the act of continuing to tend a living thing through decades of catastrophe that feels to me like a kind of philosophy, a quiet argument for continuity, for rootedness, for the idea that some things grow slowly and cannot be rushed, and that this is not a weakness but a form of power. Now I want to address something that sometimes comes up when we talk about women's history like this, and I want to address it directly because I think it matters. There is a tendency sometimes to romanticize these stories, to look at a woman tending her garden in the middle of a war and see it primarily as a symbol of peace, of softness, of retreat. And I understand the appeal of that reading. It is comforting. But I think it does these women a disservice. Margaret Beaufort was not retreating into her garden because the world was too hard and she needed comfort, though perhaps sometimes she did. She was retreating into her garden because it was the one space where the rules of the game did not apply to her, where she could think without being watched, plan without being heard, connect with people on terms that she, not the protocol of the court, had set. The garden was not where she rested from power. It was where she exercised it. And I think that distinction between the gardener's escape and the gardener's strategy is one of the most important and most overlooked threads running through women's history. Because these women were not fragile. They were not hiding. They were operating. By the time Margaret Beaufort died in the summer of 1509, just weeks after the coronation of her grandson King Henry VIII, the culmination of everything she had worked toward, she was one of the most educated, most powerful, and most politically effective women England had ever produced. She'd founded colleges at Oxford and Cambridge that still exist today. She had translated devotional texts from French into English. She had run a household that functioned as a shadow court for decades, and she had done most of it through networks that were built, sustained, and protected in the enclosed gardens of the English nobility. The Roses, as one historian put it recently, were doing a great deal of work. I love that line. It deserves to be said twice. The Roses were doing a great deal of work. Which brings us to the next woman in our story, and this one you will have heard of. In fact, almost everyone has heard of her, but almost no one knows the garden. At a palace on the Thames in the 1530s, a queen was building something extraordinary, a set of garden spaces so carefully designed, so deliberately personal, so layered with meaning and ambition, and something that I can only describe as defiance, that even after her enemies tried to erase every trace of her existence, the garden spoke on her behalf. The palace was Hampton Court. The Queen was Anne Boleyn, and what she built there in the brief, brilliant, terrifying years of her reign tells us something about her that no portrait ever could. Hampton Court in the 1530s was not yet the palace you might have seen in photographs or visited on a quiet afternoon in Surrey. It was louder, rawer, more alive. Henry VIII had seized it from Cardinal Wolsey in 1529, and by the time Anne Boleyn became queen in 1533, the two of them were pouring money into it at a rate that would make a modern accountant weep. Historians estimate that Henry spent the equivalent of roughly 18 million modern British pounds on Hampton Court during those years, expanding it, refining it, making it the most theatrically magnificent royal residence in England. And Anne, who had been educated at the French court, who'd absorbed the Renaissance sensibility of Francis I's palaces, who understood that beauty was never just beauty but always also argument, Anne had opinions. Very specific opinions about the gardens. Here is something that the general histories of Anne Boleyn tend to skip over, and I find this omission genuinely puzzling, because what she commissioned at Hampton Court is one of the most revealing self-portraits she ever created. In the years between her coronation and her arrest, roughly 1533 to 1536, Anne worked with the royal surveyors and garden designers to create a series of garden spaces at Hampton Court that were unlike anything previously built at an English palace. The centrepiece was a complex of enclosed garden rooms connected by covered walkways called galleries. These galleries were actually painted in vivid colours, with the intertwined initials of Henry and Anne, and with Anne's personal heraldic badge, the white falcon. Now heraldry in the Tudor period was not decoration. It was language. Every badge, every symbol, every colour carried precise meaning that any educated person of the time could read as clearly as we read words. Anne's white falcon was shown crowned, standing on a bed of red and white Tudor roses, holding a sceptre. A falcon, crowned, holding power. In the context of the 1530s, when the legitimacy of Anne's queenship was being argued about in every court in Europe, when the Pope had not recognised her marriage, when half of England still considered Catherine of Aragon the rightful queen, that image repeated in the stained glass of the garden buildings, carved into the stonework of the archways, painted onto the gallery walls, that was not decorative. That was a statement. And she was making it in a garden. Let me paint the picture more precisely, because the details here are extraordinary. The garden complex Anne helped design included what the building accounts call banqueting houses, a slightly misleading term because these were not simply dining rooms. They were sophisticated garden pavilions, small buildings of considerable elegance positioned at key points within the garden, so that a person moving through the space encountered them as a sequence of discoveries. The grandest of these structures was built on top of a raised mound, an artificial hill 40 feet high, constructed entirely by hand, called the Great Round Arbour. 40 feet, entirely by hand. Think about that for a moment. In the 1530s, with no machinery beyond human labour and rudimentary tools, someone's working for months built a small mountain inside a palace garden so that a building could sit at its summit and offer a view across the Thames Valley. The windows of the Great Round Arbour were glazed with hundreds of panes of coloured glass. The building accounts, which survive and have been studied by historians at historic royal palaces, record the name of the master glazier Gallion Hone, born in Bruges, one of the finest craftsmen working in England at the time. And those glass panels, many of them were decorated with the arms and badges of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn together. This was a building that announced in glass and light that the Queen who stood at its summit was real, was legitimate, was permanent. She was not permanent, but she believed she was, Or perhaps she was determined to act as though she was, which is not quite the same thing, but is in some ways braver. Something I want to pause on here because I think it touches something universal. Have you ever done something like that? Put your name on something, planted something, made something that said quietly but clearly, I was here, I existed, this is mine. I think we all have that impulse, and I think it is one of the most human things there is. Anne Boleyn, with all the resources of a Tudor queen, and all the anxiety of a woman whose position was never entirely secure, channeled that impulse into a garden. She was building her legacy in rose bushes and stained glass and 40 feet of carefully shaped earth. There were other elements to the garden that tell us things about Anne that the formal portraits cannot. The paths between the garden rooms were lined with painted wooden poles, each topped with a heraldic beast: the king's lion, the queen's falcon, the greyhound, the dragon carved and gilded and holding shields with royal arms. These were called the king's beasts, though in practice they represented the combined heraldry of the royal couple. Visitors walking through the garden would have moved through a corridor of these figures like walking through a gallery of claims, each one saying, "This union is real, this queen is recognized. These two people have built something together." The planting within the garden rooms was equally considered. Contemporary descriptions mention beds of herbs and sweet-smelling flowers, the kind of planting associated with pleasure and intimacy rather than display. Violets, which in the Tudor symbolic vocabulary were associated with faithfulness. Gillyflowers, what we now call carnations, which represented love. Whether Anne personally chose every plant or directed a team of gardeners who then interpreted her wishes we cannot know for certain. But the garden as a whole reads like a composed piece of music. Nothing in it is accidental. And then in May of 1536, everything stopped. Anne Boleyn was arrested on charges that historians have debated ever since. She was taken to the Tower of London. She was tried. She was found guilty. On the 19th of May, 1536, she was executed on Tower Green. She was somewhere between 28 and 35 years old. Her exact birth year is still debated by scholars, and within days of her death, Henry VIII issued orders to remove every trace of Anne from every royal palace. The stonemasons came to Hampton Court, the carpenters came, the glaziers came. Her initials were chiselled from the stonework, her badges were removed from the walls, the stained glass panels in the great round arbour, those hundreds of panes bearing the arms of Henry and Anne together, were taken down and replaced with the arms of Jane Seymour, Henry's new queen, who would be married to him within 11 days of Anne's death. 11 days. I always stop at that number. It tells you something about the speed with which lives were rewritten in the Tudor court, about how quickly the story was meant to change. But here is the thing about gardens. They are very hard to completely erase. The mound is still there at Hampton Court. The raised earth that once supported the great round arbour has softened with 5 centuries of weather, but it is still visible, still present, still standing in the landscape as a kind of ghost. And in the great hall of the palace, which was built specifically during Anne's time as queen, completed in 1535, 2 details survived the systematic erasure. The first, a carved wooden panel high on the wall, showing a lover's knot with the intertwined initials H and A twined together with honeysuckle. The second, Anne's white falcon, worked into the masonry, overlooking a space that was meant to have forgotten her entirely. The carpenters missed them. Or, and this is the interpretation I find myself returning to, knowing that it is unprovable, but also that it is very human, perhaps some of them did not miss them at all. Perhaps some craftsman working in that hall in the weeks after Anne's death looked at his chisel and then looked at the carving and simply moved on to the next task. A small act of refusal, a tiny deniable preservation. I cannot prove it, but I believe it is possible. because these were people, not machines. And people even in the midst of royal orders and mortal consequences sometimes keep things. The garden at Hampton Court, most of it is gone now, transformed beyond recognition by the garden fashions of subsequent centuries. King William III tore down Anne's entire private wing in the 1690s to build his Baroque apartments, but the story of what she built there, the deliberate layered symbol-laden language of a garden, designed by a woman who understood that beauty could be argument, that flowers could be testimony, that a mound of earth 40 feet high could be a declaration of existence. That story has been preserved in the building accounts, in the glazier's records, in the architectural surveys, and in 2 small carvings in a great hall that outlasted everything the 16th century tried to do to them. There is a lesson here, and I do not want to overstate it, but I also do not want to leave it unspoken. The erasure failed, not dramatically, not with fanfare, not with a great reversal of history, but quietly in the way that real things tend to persist through the stubbornness of physical objects, through the diligence of historians, through the survival of account books that nobody thought to destroy because nobody thought they mattered. Anne Boleyn built a garden to say, I am here, I am real, this is mine, and 500 years later we are still in it. The story of the Tudor garden does not end with Anne. In fact, in some ways it begins again, transformed by grief, reshaped by survival, grown from entirely different soil. Because the woman who came after all this, who inherited the aftermath of Anne's story, who knew exactly how close to the edge a queen could stand and still survive, she built something very different. Not a garden of declaration, not a garden of power, a garden of healing. And the story of what she grew there and why and what it tells us about the art of surviving in a world that has tried to break you, that is where we are going next. Survivors know things that other people do not. That is not a romantic idea, it is a practical one. When you have moved through danger and come out the other side, when you have watched what happens to people who trusted the wrong things, you develop a particular kind of intelligence. Quiet, observational, rooted in what is real rather than what is supposed to be real. The women who came of age in the Tudor court of the 1540s had all survived something. Some had survived the terror of the Boleyn years. Some had survived the sweating sickness that moved through England like a slow catastrophe, taking neighbours and relatives and occasionally kings. Some had simply survived the ordinary brutality of childbirth and illness in an era before any of the medicines we take entirely for granted. And many of them, far more than the history books typically acknowledge, channeled that survivors' intelligence into their gardens. Not the decorative gardens, not the gardens of heraldry and display we talked about in the last part of our story. The other gardens, the ones tucked behind walls facing south to catch the maximum hours of sunlight, the ones that smelled not of roses but of something sharper, of sage and wormwood and the clean medicinal bite of fresh-cut rosemary, the ones where the women who tended them were not performing queenliness or staging political theatre. They were working. The physic garden, the garden of medicinal plants, is one of the most consistently misrepresented spaces in the history of noblewomen, and I want to spend some time correcting that misrepresentation, because it genuinely changes how we understand what these women were doing with their lives. The standard image when people think of a medieval or Tudor noblewoman growing herbs is something vaguely domestic, charming perhaps, a little quaint. A woman in a nice dress snipping some lavender, perhaps making her house smell pleasant. That image is almost entirely wrong. The reality is considerably more impressive and considerably more rigorous. Take Lady Grace Mildmay. Grace Mildmay was born around 1552 into the English gentry, not quite the highest nobility, but firmly within the world of great houses and significant land. She married Anthony Mildmay, a knight, and spent most of her adult life at Apperthorpe Hall in Northamptonshire. managing a household of considerable complexity. And over the course of her adult life, Grace Mildmay compiled a set of medical notebooks that survive to this day. Those notebooks contain more than 500 individual medical recipes and treatments. 500. And we are not talking about folk remedies passed down through superstition. We are talking about carefully observed, empirically tested, systematically recorded treatments for conditions ranging from fevers and digestive disorders to skin conditions, respiratory illnesses, and complications of pregnancy. Grace Mildmay's notebooks record not just the recipes themselves, but notes on outcomes, what worked, what required adjustment, what doses were effective for patients of different sizes and ages. She cross-referenced her observations with the leading medical texts of her era, including the work of Galen, which she had read in translation. She was in every meaningful sense of the word practicing medicine, and the source of most of her materials, the plants that formed the basis of the majority of her treatments, was a physic garden. Now here is something I find fascinating when I sit with this history. Grace Mildmay was not unusual. She was not exceptional in the sense of being a rare outlier. She was exceptional in the sense that her notebooks survived, which is a different kind of exceptionalism entirely. The historical records suggest that women of her class, women managing large households in the 16th and 17th centuries, were almost universally expected to have medical knowledge, expected to grow the plants they needed, expected to treat the members of their households, which could include not just family but servants, labourers, tenants, and neighbours. A visiting physician was expensive and often unavailable. A woman with a well-maintained physic garden and the knowledge to use it was for most people outside the major cities the primary form of healthcare available to them. Think about that scale for a moment. These women were not hobbyists. They were the medical system. What did a Tudor physic garden actually contain? Because I think this is one of those places where the specific details are more interesting than the general idea. The plant lists from surviving household records and gardening manuals of the period give us a remarkably clear picture. Feverfew used for headaches, which we now know contains parthenolide, a compound that modern research has confirmed has anti-inflammatory properties relevant to migraine treatment. Valerian used to calm anxiety and promote sleep, which remains in use in herbal medicine today. Comfrey applied to bruises and sprains containing allantoin, a compound that genuinely accelerates cell growth and wound healing. Willow bark used to treat fevers and pain containing salicin, the precursor compound to what we now call aspirin. Foxglove used carefully in small doses for certain heart conditions, containing digitalis, which became the basis for an entire class of modern cardiac medications. These women were not working with magic. They were working with chemistry without the vocabulary of chemistry, but with generations of accumulated observational knowledge about what plants did to human bodies and under what circumstances. William Turner, who is often called the father of English botany, and who published his landmark work called A New Herbal, in 1,551 dedicated portions of his work, specifically to the gardens of noble households and the women who maintained them. He wrote with genuine respect, occasionally with something that reads very much like admiration about the precision and sophistication of the planting and preparation practices he observed. And here I have to ask you something, because I genuinely want to know your reaction to this. Does it change anything for you knowing this? Knowing that those women who are so often painted as purely decorative figures existing in the margins of history, attending on kings and having children and very little else, were also running what were effectively small pharmaceutical operations out of their back gardens. It changes something for me every time I return to it. It makes me look differently at the image of a noblewoman with her garden basket, at the herb beds in the corners of castle courtyards, at the south-facing walls against which the more delicate medicinal plants were trained to grow, All of that was not decoration. It was infrastructure. One of the women who understood this most completely was Bess of Hardwicke. Elizabeth Talbot, Countess of Shrewsbury, known to history as Bess of Hardwicke, was born around 1527, and she lived to be approximately 87 years old, which in the Elizabethan era was a lifespan of almost mythological proportions. She married 4 times. She built or substantially rebuilt 4 great houses. She accumulated a fortune that made her at the time of her death one of the wealthiest people in England after the Queen herself, and she was meticulous about her gardens. The household accounts at Hardwicke Hall, which survive in extraordinary detail, record the Physic Garden's contents across multiple decades. The accounts list not just the plants but the quantities, the sources, the prices paid for seeds and cuttings from other estates, the names of the gardeners assigned to each section, and the regular request from the household for specific preparations. One entry from the 1590s records a payment for a large quantity of distilling equipment, copper stills, glass vessels, ceramic pots, for what the accounts describe as the ladies' distilling room adjoining the herb garden, a distilling room. Bess of Hardwicke had adjacent to her physic garden a dedicated laboratory for processing medicinal plants into concentrated preparations, essential oils, tinctures, distilled waters, dried and powdered herbs measured into precise doses. This was not a hobby room. This was a production facility. The distilling work done in spaces like Bess's and in the similar rooms maintained by dozens of other noble households across Tudor and Jacobean England produced preparations that were used not just within the household, but were regularly given as gifts to neighbours, distributed to tenants in times of illness, and in some cases sold or exchanged. There are letters surviving from Bess of Hardwicke to friends and family, in which she encloses small packages carefully wrapped preparations from her distilling room, along with specific instructions for their use, dosages, timing, cautions about particular conditions. She sounds in those letters exactly like what she was a physician writing to patients, without the title, without the professional recognition, without any of the formal apparatus that would have made her work visible to the historical record as medicine rather than as housewifery. That gap between what women were actually doing and what history was prepared to call it that gap runs through this entire story we're telling tonight like a fault line in the ground. You only notice it when you look for it, but once you see it, it is everywhere. There is a detail from the household management manuals of the Tudor period that I think about more than is probably reasonable. These manuals, written almost entirely by men as advice for the running of noble households, consistently describe the physic garden and the distilling work associated with it as part of the mistress's charge, her responsibility, her domain. But here is what those same manuals do not say. They do not describe this work as medical practice. They do not frame it as expertise. They frame it as management, as stewardship, as one item in a long list of household duties sandwiched between overseeing the laundry and supervising the kitchen accounts. The same work that performed by a man with a university degree and a set of Latin credentials would have been called medicine was when performed by a woman in a garden called housekeeping. I do not say this with anger. I say it with a particular kind of tired recognition that comes from reading the same erasure in too many different centuries. These women knew what they were doing. Their patients knew what they were doing. History just needed a few extra centuries to catch up. By the time we reached the middle of the 16th century, the physic garden of the Tudor noblewoman had become something genuinely remarkable, a space that combined botanical science, pharmaceutical practice, and in the quieter moments between the measuring and the distilling and the careful recording of what worked something, that functioned as a form of intellectual life. Because to maintain a physic garden at the level these women maintained theirs required reading, observation, reasoning, the ability to hold a complex body of knowledge in mind and apply it flexibly to changing circumstances. It required, in short, exactly the kind of educated intelligence that the formal world consistently told these women they were not supposed to need. And they did it anyway. In the garden, behind the walls, in the spaces between what was expected of them. Which brings me to the woman who I think understood all of this most personally, most painfully, most completely. A woman who had stood at the very edge of what the Tudor court could do to a person, who had watched it closely enough to know every one of its mechanisms, and who, when she was finally free of it, retreated to a garden in the Cotswolds and built something there that was unlike anything we have talked about so far. Not a garden of power, not a garden of political strategy, not even quite a garden of medicine, a garden of beginning again. Her name was Catherine Parr, and her story is waiting for us just on the other side of this. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from hard work but from sustained vigilance, from years of watching your words before they leave your mouth, from learning over a very long time exactly how much of yourself is safe to show and exactly how much must stay hidden, from the constant low-level calculation of proximity to danger that becomes eventually so habitual you stop noticing you're doing it. If you have ever lived through a period like that, even a much smaller version of it, a difficult workplace, a complicated relationship, a season of life where you felt genuinely unsafe, then you will understand something about Catherine Parr that I think the history books have consistently failed to convey. She was tired, not the tired that sleep fixes, the other kind. Catherine Parr was born around 1512 into a Westmoreland family of modest but respectable gentry. She was educated well, unusually well for a woman of her era, and by the time she was in her late 20s she had already been widowed twice. Her first husband, Edward Burrough, died in 1533. Her second husband, John Neville Lord Latimer, died in 1543. She was 31 years old. She had been a wife and a stepmother and a manager of households since she was a teenager. She had nursed Lord Latimer through several years of serious illness. She had, by her own later account, spent more of her adult life caring for dying men than she had spent on anything else. And then, before she had properly finished grieving her second husband, Henry VIII, decided he wanted to marry her. There are historians who have framed this as a great honour, and in the formal political sense of the Tudor court it was. To become Queen of England was the highest position available to any woman born in that time and place. But Catherine Parr knew what it had cost the previous queens. She knew it intimately. She had watched it from inside the court. Catherine of Aragon set aside after 24 years of marriage, dying in cold and isolation, separated from her daughter. Anne Boleyn executed. Jane Seymour dead of complications after childbirth less than 2 weeks after delivering the son Henry had always wanted. Anne of Cleves married and discarded within 6 months, escaped with her life largely because she was diplomatically convenient to release rather than convenient to destroy. Catherine Howard executed. She was approximately 17 years old. Catherine Parr became the 6th wife of Henry VIII in July of 1543. She was by any reasonable assessment walking into a situation that had already consumed 5 women before her. She survived. She's the only one of Henry's 6 wives who outlived him, and the margin was not comfortable. In 1546, just over a year before Henry died, she came extraordinarily close to being arrested for heresy. A warrant had actually been signed. The men who were coming to take her to the Tower were already on their way. Through a combination of personal courage, rapid political manoeuvring, and what contemporaries described as a remarkable conversation with Henry, in which she managed to reframe her theological discussions as merely wifely curiosity Rather than dangerous reform, she survived. The men with the warrant arrived to find her walking in the garden with the king. The garden, even then, even at that moment of maximum danger, the garden was where she went. Henry, apparently discomfited by the whole situation, dismissed the arresting party and walked with her back into the palace. She'd escaped with her life by what can only be described as the width of a garden path. Henry VIII died in January of 1547, and Catherine Parr, 35 years old, widowed for the third time the Dowager Queen of England, one of the most educated women of her generation, the author of a devotional book called The Lamentations of a Sinner, that had been published in 1547, and was remarkably one of the first books published in English. Under a woman's own name, Catherine Parr went to Sudeley Castle in the Cotswolds in Gloucestershire, a castle of warm golden stone set against the green of the English countryside, with the kind of landscape that makes you understand physically and immediately why people have been writing poetry about England for 1,000 years. She went with Thomas Seymour, her fourth husband, a man she had actually loved before Henry had intervened, a man she married with what her letters describe as genuine happiness, with something approaching relief within months of Henry's death. And at Sudeley she planted a garden. Now I want to be careful here about something because I think it matters. It would be easy to tell the story of Catherine Parr's garden at Sudeley as a simple redemption narrative. Woman escapes terrible situation, finds peace, grows roses, lives happily. Curtain. The reality is more complicated and therefore more interesting, and I think ultimately more true to what gardens actually do for people. Catherine Parr arrived at Sudeley carrying everything she had survived: the years of calculation, the constant awareness of danger, the peculiar loneliness of being the most visible woman in England while having almost no one she could speak to honestly, the grief of the women she had known who had not made it out. She was not healed when she arrived at Sudeley, she was raw, and the garden she created there, the records of which survive in the household accounts of the castle in letters she wrote to friends in the descriptions of visitors, was not a finished thing. It was a working thing, an ongoing conversation between a person and a piece of earth. The garden at Sudeley was large by the standards of a private residence, not a royal palace scale, but substantial. It was enclosed in the tradition we have been following throughout this story, with stone walls that caught the warmth of the Cotswold sun. It was planted with flowers and herbs and fruit trees. It had paths designed for walking longer paths than a purely ornamental garden would require, paths meant to be walked repeatedly in the rhythm of someone who thinks while moving. One of Catherine's ladies in waiting, writing in a letter from Sudeley in the summer of 1547, described the Queen Dowager spending several hours each morning in the garden, walking, reading, occasionally directing the gardeners, but mostly simply present in the space. "She seems more herself here," the lady wrote, "than I have seen her be in many years." More herself. I keep coming back to that phrase, because it implies with quiet precision that there had been years, many years, when she'd been less herself, when the self had been put away somewhere for safekeeping and only the performance remained. The garden at Sudeley was where the performance stopped. Let me tell you something about what the physic and pleasure garden at Sudeley contained, because I think the planting choices are telling in ways that go beyond simple aesthetics. The records show an unusual emphasis on plants associated with what Tudor herbalists called the comfort of the spirits. Lavender in large quantities planted along the main paths so that walking brushed against it and released the scent. Sweetbriar roses whose leaves smell of apple when touched, and which were understood in the herbal tradition of the period to gladden the heart. Lemon balm which Tudor physicians prescribed for melancholy. Borage whose bright blue flowers were held in the medical understanding of the time to drive away sorrow. I'm not suggesting Catherine Parr sat down and consciously designed a therapeutic landscape based on the emotional properties of her plant choices. The historical record does not support that level of intentionality. But I do think something was working in her that knew what she needed, and that the choosing of these particular plants, the lavender and the sweetbriar and the borage, was not accidental. She had spent her adult life studying medicine. She understood what plants did to human bodies and human moods. She understood better than almost anyone alive in England at that moment the relationship between a living environment and the quality of a person's inner life. She planted accordingly. There is a question I want to ask you here, and I mean it genuinely, not as a rhetorical device. Have you ever done something like that? Created a space, even a small one, even just a corner of a room or a particular walk you take, that was specifically designed to make you feel more like yourself, not to impress anyone, not to signal anything to the outside world, just a space that was calibrated consciously or instinctively to the particular frequency of who you actually are. Because I think what Catherine Parr did at Sudeley was a very sophisticated version of exactly that. And I think it is something human beings have been doing for as long as we have had access to growing things. The garden as self-portrait, the garden as prescription, the garden as the conversation you are having with yourself when the noise of everything else finally goes quiet. The story of Sudeley does not have a happy ending, at least not in the conventional sense. Catherine Parr became pregnant in the autumn of 1547. Her daughter Mary Seymour was born in August of 1548. Catherine Parr died 6 days later of what was almost certainly puerperal fever, the same infection that had killed Jane Seymour, the same risk that every woman of her era carried into every birth. She was 35 or 36 years old. She had been free, genuinely free, for perhaps the first time in her adult life for barely 18 months. She is buried at St. Mary's Church, which sits within the grounds of Sudeley Castle itself. It is one of the very few royal graves in England that remains in a private setting on private land rather than in a cathedral or a royal chapel. And the garden she created transformed many times over the subsequent centuries, as all living things are, is still there. Sudeley Castle today maintains what they call the Queen's Garden, on the site of what was Catherine's original enclosed garden. It is planted with white and purple flowers, the Tudor colours of mourning and royalty combined, and on a quiet morning before the visitors arrive, it is said to be one of the most peaceful places in the Cotswolds. I find something very moving about that continuity, about the fact that the space she created to feel more like herself, a space that existed for barely 2 years before she died, has been tended and replanted and renewed, and tended again for nearly 500 years since. There is nothing in the act of gardening that resists endings more stubbornly than almost any other human activity. You plant something, you tend it, it grows beyond you. Catherine Parr planted borage for sorrow and lavender for comfort, and the ground at Sudeley has been growing things ever since. The story does not stay in England, though, because while Catherine Parr was finding her way back to herself in the Cotswolds, something entirely different was happening across the Alps, in the sun-warmed courtyards and terraced hillsides of the Italian Renaissance. There the garden had evolved into something with its own entirely distinct language, not the language of power, not the language of medicine, not even the language of survival, the language of flowers, literal flowers, chosen with precise intentionality, arranged in patterns that any educated woman of the period could read as clearly as a letter, and the messages being sent through those arrangements between women who could not always speak openly in courts, where correspondence was read and conversations were overheard. Some of those messages were tender, some were dangerous, and some of them were both at once. Cross the Alps on a clear day in the late 1400s and the world changes colour. The grey-green of the English countryside, that particular shade of persistent apologetic dampness, gives way to something warmer, more deliberate, as if the landscape itself has opinions about beauty and has been cultivating them for several centuries. This is northern Italy, the Po Valley, the world of the Este family in Ferrara, the Gonzaga family in Mantua, the Sforza family in Milan. Tiny independent states, each one a universe of art and politics and ambition, each one governed by people who understood that cultural sophistication was not a luxury, but a survival strategy, that to be seen as civilized, as refined, as the patron of beautiful things, was to be taken seriously in a world where power was constantly being renegotiated. And in this world the noblewomen of the Italian Renaissance courts did something with their gardens that was different from anything happening north of the Alps. They turned them into a language, a precise, codified, mutually understood language spoken entirely in flowers. Before we go any further, I want to be honest about something, because I think intellectual honesty is always more interesting than a tidy narrative. When people talk about the language of flowers, what the Victorians formerly called floriography, they tend to locate it in the 19th century, in those wonderful, slightly overwrought Victorian gift books that assigned specific meanings to specific blooms with the seriousness of a legal document. Red rose means love. Yellow rose means jealousy. Forget-me-not means, well, do not forget me. And it is absolutely true that the Victorians systematized and popularized and somewhat overcomplicated this tradition. But the tradition itself is considerably older, and in the Renaissance courts of Italy it operated with a sophistication and a political edge that the Victorian version, charming as it was, never quite matched. The difference is this: the Victorian language of flowers was largely about sentiment, about conveying private feelings through a socially acceptable coded medium. The Italian Renaissance version was about that too, but it was also sometimes primarily about power, about alliance, about the sending of messages that needed to be deniable, that needed to exist simultaneously as innocent garden decoration and as precise political communication. Which is, when you think about it, a remarkable thing to ask a flower to do. Let me introduce you to Isabella d'Este. If you have not encountered her before, I genuinely envy you the experience of meeting her for the first time, because she is one of the most extraordinary figures of the entire Renaissance period, and she is nowhere near as famous as she deserves to be. Isabella d'Este was born in Ferrara in May of 1474, the eldest daughter of Ercole I, Duke of Ferrara, and Eleanor of Aragon. She was educated with her brother Alfonso at one of the most intellectually sophisticated courts in Europe, studying Latin, Greek, music, dance, mathematics, and the political history of the Italian states from childhood. She married Francesco Gonzaga, Marquis of Mantua, in 1490 when she was 15, and for the next 50 years she proceeded to become, by the general consensus of her contemporaries and subsequent historians alike, the single, most culturally influential woman in Renaissance Italy. Her correspondence, and here is a number that still stops me cold every time I see it. Her surviving correspondence runs to more than 13,000 letters. 13,000. Written to popes, emperors, artists, poets, merchants, ambassadors, foreign princes, and crucially for our story, to a network of noblewomen across the Italian peninsula and beyond, with whom she maintained relationships of extraordinary complexity and depth. And woven through that correspondence again and again are references to her garden. The garden Isabella created at the Gonzaga Palace in Mantua was famous across Europe during her lifetime. It was called the Giardino Segreto, the secret garden, and that name was not merely romantic, it was functional. The garden was literally private, enclosed within the palace complex, accessible only from Isabella's own apartments, not from the general court spaces. She could enter it from her studiolo, her famous private study, which was itself a masterpiece of Renaissance interior design, its walls lined with paintings commissioned from the greatest artists of the age, Mantegna, Perugino, Lorenzo Costa. The connection between the studiolo and the garden was deliberate. The two spaces functioned as a single private universe, the interior room of the mind and the exterior room of the senses joined by a single door. In the studiolo she thought and read and wrote. In the garden she received. And what she received there and how those receptions were conducted was shaped significantly by the planting. Here is where the floral language becomes genuinely interesting. The Italian Renaissance had inherited from classical antiquity a rich symbolic vocabulary for plants and flowers derived from Ovid, from Pliny, from Virgil, from the Greek mythological tradition that the humanist scholars of the Renaissance were actively recovering and reinterpreting. Every educated person of the period understood, at least in broad terms, that the rose was associated with Venus, and therefore with love and desire, that the laurel was associated with Apollo, and therefore with intellectual achievement and poetic glory, that the myrtle was sacred to Venus and used at weddings, that ivy signified fidelity and constancy, that the lily signified purity but also in a specifically Italian Renaissance reading royal or aristocratic ambition, and Isabella d'Este, who was nothing if not a careful reader of symbolic vocabularies, planted her garden with these meanings in mind. There is a letter written in 1503 to a noblewoman in Ferrara, with whom Isabella had a long and complex relationship that historians have described variously as friendship rivalry, and something that does not quite fit either category. In the letter, Isabella describes sending a cutting from her garden, a specific variety of gillyflower carnation in English, along with a note that makes no explicit reference to what the flower means. But in the symbolic vocabulary of the Italian Renaissance, the gillyflower meant I have not forgotten. I remain constant. The bond between us holds. The recipient would have understood this immediately. Any educated noblewoman of the period would have. It was in effect a diplomatic communication disguised as a garden gift. Deniable, unrecorded in any formal correspondence, but perfectly legible to the person it was intended for. Can I tell you what I find most fascinating about this? It is not the cleverness of the code, though the cleverness is real and worth appreciating. It is the sheer volume of work it required. To maintain a garden as a medium of communication, to keep the right plants in cultivation, to have cuttings and arrangements available at the right moments, to understand the symbolic vocabulary well enough to compose messages with it, required years of accumulated knowledge and ongoing maintenance. Isabella d'Este was running essentially a living library of symbols, a garden that was also an archive of relationships and obligations and quietly stated positions. And she was doing this at the same time as she was managing the Gonzaga court during her husband's frequent absences, which were sometimes diplomatic, sometimes military, and occasionally the result of the kind of personal behaviour that required his wife to quietly manage the fallout. She was in short doing approximately 4 jobs simultaneously, while also maintaining a garden sophisticated enough to function as a private postal system. I find this exhausting and magnificent in equal measure. The book that perhaps best captures what these Italian Renaissance garden conversations looked like from the outside, from the perspective of someone trying to understand their layered meanings, is a strange and beautiful text published in Venice in 1499. It is called the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, which translates roughly as the dream struggle of Polyphilo. And if that title does not immediately make you want to read it, the subtitle might. It is in essence a long, elaborately illustrated dream vision in which the narrator moves through a series of extraordinary gardens, encountering ancient ruins, mysterious inscriptions, and a series of women who communicate through flower arrangements that the narrator must decode. The book was published anonymously and its authorship is still debated. But what is significant for our purposes is not who wrote it is what it assumes about its readers. The encoded floral messages in the Hypnerotomachia are presented without explanation. The author does not pause to tell you what the flowers mean. He expects you to already know, which means that the audience for this book, the educated, wealthy, court-connected readers of late 15th century Italy, were expected to carry this symbolic vocabulary in their heads as ordinary knowledge, as common literacy. And who in the Renaissance court was most consistently trained in this literacy? The women. Because here is something that rarely gets pointed out in the histories of Renaissance garden culture. The men of these courts were largely outdoors, on campaign at tournaments in council chambers, riding between cities in the constant movement of Renaissance political life. They were present in their courts in concentrated bursts and then gone again. The women were present continuously. They were the ones who lived with the gardens on a daily basis, who watched what bloomed in which season, who understood through years of patient observation the particular characteristics of each plant when it flowered, how long it lasted, what conditions it needed, what it looked like in each stage of its growth. They had, in other words, the kind of knowledge that only comes from sustained intimate attention over a long period of time, and they used that knowledge, as we've seen throughout this story, with considerably more intention than anyone around them gave them credit for. Isabella d'Este died in 1539 at the age of 64, having outlasted most of her contemporaries, having navigated the Italian wars that dismembered several of the states around her, having seen her son Federigo become Duke of Mantua, and her daughter Eleonora become Duchess of Urbino. She left behind those 13,000 letters, a studiolo full of commissioned masterpieces, a garden that no longer exists in its original form, but whose influence can be traced through the garden culture of the entire Italian Renaissance, and a way of understanding the relationship between women, gardens, and language that was, as we will see, about to collide with something very different, something very large, something designed not to create privacy, but to eliminate it entirely. Because while Isabella d'Este was cultivating her secret garden in Mantua, the most ambitious building project in European history was slowly taking shape on a plain outside Paris. A palace so vast that it contained its own city. Gardens so formal, so geometric, so deliberately imposing that they made the enclosed gardens of every previous century look like children's drawings. Versailles. And the women who lived inside it, who were surrounded by the most spectacular garden architecture ever created by human hands, a garden that covered more than 800 hectares of the French countryside. Those women were perhaps the most garden-starved of any we have met tonight. Because Versailles was many things, but it was never for the women who lived there a refuge. It was a stage, and the difference between a garden that frees you and a garden that performs you, that difference is where our next part of the story begins. Let me describe something to you. You're standing at the top of the steps of the Palace of Versailles, looking out over the gardens. What you see stretching before you for what feels like the entire distance between you and the horizon is geometry made out of living things. Perfectly clipped hedges forming walls of green that run in straight lines for hundreds of meters without a single deviation. Parterres, those elaborate flat garden beds laid out in patterns so intricate and so symmetrical that from above they look like the pages of an illuminated manuscript, except that the ink is made of coloured gravel, and precisely trimmed boxwood and flowers planted in rows so exact that a slightly misaligned stem would apparently have been noticed and corrected before the morning was out. Fountains, 50 of them eventually connected by an engineering system so ambitious that Louis XIV spent 30 years and a small fortune trying to make it work reliably. with mixed results. 210,000 trees. That number is documented. 210,000 trees planted according to a plan drawn up by the royal garden designer André Le Nôtre, arranged to create vistas and perspectives and deliberate illusions of infinite space. 800 and some hectares. For reference, that is roughly 2,000 acres, an area larger than many small towns. It is by any measure one of the most extraordinary things human beings have ever built, and for the women who lived inside it much of the time, it felt like a very beautiful trap. To understand why, you need to understand what Le Nôtre was actually designing. André Le Nôtre was a genius. I want to be clear about that before I say anything critical, because the work at Versailles is genuinely, technically, philosophically extraordinary, and it deserves to be recognized as such. But Le Nôtre was designing for a specific purpose, and that purpose was not the comfort or privacy of the people who would live within the garden. He was designing for visibility. Everything about the French formal garden, the straight lines, the open parterres, the long allées cut through the bosquets, was engineered to ensure that anyone within the garden could be seen from multiple vantage points simultaneously. This was not accidental. It was the whole point. Louis XIV, who had spent his childhood terrified by the aristocratic uprising called the Fronde, who had watched his mother and his court flee Paris in the middle of the night when he was 9 years old, had a lifelong, deep, entirely rational fear of what powerful people did when they were out of his sight. His solution was elegant in its brutality: ensure that no one was ever entirely out of sight. The garden was part of that system. Those long straight paths that cut through the bosquets, the woodland garden rooms, were designed so that a person standing at the intersection could see down 4 different corridors simultaneously. The open parterres closest to the palace were visible from the palace windows. The elevated terraces provided views over the lower garden spaces. Versailles was, among other things, a surveillance apparatus disguised as paradise. Now here is the question I genuinely want you to sit with for a moment. What does it feel like to live in a beautiful place that you know is designed to watch you? I think most of us have had some version of this experience. Not at the scale of Versailles, obviously, but that feeling of being in a space that is ostensibly comfortable and pleasant, and yet somehow never quite allows you to relax fully, where you are always at some level aware of being observed. The women of the Versailles court lived with that feeling every single day, for years, for decades, for their entire adult lives. And the letters and memoirs they left behind describe it with a vividness and an exhaustion that reaches across 3 centuries without any difficulty at all. Elizabeth Charlotte, Princess Palatine, known in the French court as Madame, which was the title given to the wife of the king's brother, wrote letters. Enormous quantities of letters, thousands of them to relatives and friends across Europe, spanning 50 years of life at the French court. She was German by birth from the Electoral Palatinate, and she had arrived in France in 1671 to marry Philippe, Duke of Orléans, the younger brother of Louis XIV. She was 19 years old. She spoke French with an accent she never lost. She missed the forests of her childhood with an intensity that never dimmed, and she wrote with a directness that was sometimes startling for the period about what life at Versailles actually felt like from the inside. In one letter written to her Aunt Sophia of Hanover in the 1690s, she describes walking in the gardens of Versailles and experiencing something that I think deserves to be quoted carefully, because it is one of the most precise descriptions of a specific kind of psychological discomfort I have ever read in a historical document. She writes, and I am paraphrasing her French into English keeping, as close to her meaning as the translation allows, that the garden at Versailles is a place of extraordinary beauty in which one cannot rest, because beauty here is not for comfort, but for display, and one feels always that one is part of the display rather than a visitor to it. Part of the display rather than a visitor to it. That sentence deserves a moment. She was one of the most prominent women at the most spectacular court in Europe. She walked daily in gardens that kings and emperors came from across the continent to admire, and what she felt walking in those gardens was not pleasure. She felt like a piece of furniture. Madame de Maintenon, the woman who became in the 1680s the secret wife of Louis XIV himself, morganatically married to the king, in a ceremony that was never publicly acknowledged, wrote with equal clarity about what Versailles cost the people who lived there. Françoise d'Aubigné, Marquise de Maintenon, had had one of the most extraordinary lives of the 17th century before she ever arrived at Versailles. Born into poverty, imprisoned as a child when her father was arrested, married as a teenager to the elderly poet Paul Scarron, to escape destitution, widowed at 25, employed as governess to the king's illegitimate children, gradually rising through the layers of court favour until she occupied a position of unprecedented informal power. She understood what performance cost. She had been performing her entire life, and the letters she wrote in the later decades of her life when she had established her school for girls at Saint-Cyr, which was her genuine life's work, the thing she cared about more than any of the politics, are full of a longing for quiet that is almost painful to read. In one letter written around 1705, she describes walking alone very early in the morning in the kitchen garden, the Potager du Roi, rather than in the formal ornamental gardens. The Potager du Roi was not a prestige space at Versailles. It was functional. It grew vegetables for the royal table. It smelled of earth and compost rather than expensive imported flowers. And Madame de Maintenon wrote that she preferred it to every other space in the palace grounds, because it was the one place where no one expected her to be there, and therefore the one place where she was not being watched. The kitchen garden, the working garden, the garden nobody thought to surveil. She had found the one crack in the architecture of visibility, and she walked through it every morning before the court woke up. There is character in the memoirs of the Duc de Saint-Simon, those extraordinary, obsessive, sometimes scurrilous but historically invaluable records of life at Versailles, who I think about often in the context of this story. Saint-Simon describes almost in passing a noblewoman whose name he does not give, who had developed the habit of spending long periods in the bosquets, the enclosed woodland garden rooms that were set back from the main parterres accessible through archways in the tall hedges. These bosquets were the closest thing Versailles had to private enclosed spaces. They were still formally designed, still part of Le Nôtre's plan, still surveilled in theory from their entrances, but they were deeper, darker. The tall hedges blocked the sightlines from the palace. The sound of the fountains in the bosquets covered conversation. The light was different, in their filtered green softer. Saint-Simon notes with the particular tone he uses for things he considers slightly peculiar, that this woman went to the bosquets every afternoon regardless of weather, and that she stayed for hours, and that she was always alone, and that she appeared upon returning to the palace more composed than when she left, though what she did there none could say. What she did there none could say. She sat in the green dark alone for several hours a day. That was all. That was enough. I want to pause here and make an observation that I think connects everything we've been exploring in this story, from the medieval Hortus Conclusus to the physic gardens of Tudor England, to the floral diplomacy of Renaissance Italy, to the surveillance gardens of Versailles. The women in all of these stories were navigating a version of the same fundamental tension. They lived in worlds that required them to be continuously visible, continuously performing, continuously available to the gaze and the judgment and the demands of the court around them. And they found in gardens, or in the corners and cracks of gardens, the one available form of relief from that requirement. The enclosed garden, the physic garden behind the wall, the giardino segreto accessible only from the private apartments, the kitchen garden at 5 in the morning, the bosquet in the rainy afternoon, different spaces, different centuries, different women, the same need, and I find myself thinking that this need, this absolute human requirement for a space that is yours, a moment that is unwatched, a corner of existence that belongs to no one's story but your own, this need did not disappear when the courts of Europe eventually dissolved. It just moved somewhere else, into different buildings, different kinds of enclosures, different gardens or the memory of gardens or the longing for them. But the most extraordinary expression of this need, the one that was most deliberate, most fully realized, most richly documented, and most ultimately tragic, was still ahead. It was built not far from where we are standing right now in these Versailles gardens. Built specifically as an answer to everything that the grand formal garden was not. A place of winding paths rather than straight lines, of natural forms rather than geometric precision, of intimacy rather than spectacle, built by a young woman who had arrived at this court as a teenager, who'd spent years being one of the most observed human beings on earth, and who had finally been given a key, her own key, to her own door, into her own world. The Petit Trianon was waiting. And the story of what Marie Antoinette built there and why, and what it cost her, is one of the most layered, most misunderstood, and most quietly devastating stories in the entire history of women and their gardens. The key was small. That detail is recorded not in a grand official document, not in a royal proclamation, but in a letter Marie Antoinette wrote to her mother, the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, in the summer of 1774. She writes about receiving as a gift from her new husband Louis XVI the Petit Trianon and its surrounding grounds. She describes the moment almost shyly, with a restraint that feels, knowing what we know about her situation, quite moving. She had been at Versailles for 4 years by then. She had arrived as a 14-year-old bride handed across the border into France in a ceremony that required her to formally relinquish every connection to her previous life. Her Austrian attendants sent home. Her Austrian clothing replaced her Austrian identity, ceremonially set aside as if a human being could be reissued like a document. She was 19 years old when Louis gave her the Petit Trianon, and what she did with it over the next 15 years was not, as generations of critics have claimed, an act of frivolous escapism. It was an act of architecture, deliberate, considered, philosophically coherent, the most sustained and personal creative project of her life. To understand what Marie Antoinette was building at the Petit Trianon, you need to understand what she was building against. The formal gardens of Versailles, which we spent time in during the last part of our story, operated on a single organizing principle, the straight line. Everything radiated outward from the palace in perfectly controlled axes. Every vista was calculated. Every perspective was managed. The garden announced in the language of geometry that nature had been completely subdued by human will, and that human will resided entirely in the king. The English landscape garden, which had been developing in Britain through the early and middle decades of the 18th century in the work of designers like William Kent and Lancelot Brown, operated on exactly the opposite principle. Curves instead of straight lines, natural forms instead of geometric ones, irregularity instead of symmetry. The deliberate illusion that the landscape had arranged itself without human intervention, that you were walking through nature rather than through a controlled representation of it. The French aristocracy had been watching this English development with a mixture of fascination and frankly competitive anxiety. English gardens were becoming fashionable across Europe. They carried with them a philosophical association with Rousseau's ideas about the natural state, with the Enlightenment critique of artificial social structures, with the growing cultural conviction that simplicity was not poverty, but virtue. When Marie Antoinette decided to transform the grounds of the Petit Trianon from the formal botanical garden that Louis XV had maintained there into an English landscape garden, she was not just making an aesthetic choice, she was making a philosophical statement. She was saying in the language of the landscape design that the world she inhabited at the Petit Trianon operated by different rules than the world she inhabited at the palace. The transformation happened in 2 phases, and the records of both are remarkably detailed. The first phase began in 1777, 3 years after she received the property. She commissioned the architect Richard Miquet, who would become the primary designer of her vision throughout the Trianon years, to lay out an English landscape garden on the grounds. What Miquet created under Marie Antoinette's close direction and the historical record is clear that she was genuinely involved in the design decisions. Not merely a passive patron, was a garden of winding paths and artificial streams of carefully placed stands of trees and open meadow areas of small architectural features, positioned to be discovered rather than displayed. The Temple of Love, completed in 1778, is perhaps the most famous of these features. A small circular neoclassical pavilion open on all sides, set on a slight rise with a view over the surrounding landscape. Inside it, a marble sculpture of Cupid carving his bow from the club of Hercules. It sounds described baldly like standard aristocratic garden decoration. But the placement is everything. You do not see the Temple of Love from a distance, from a formal approach. You encounter it. You come around a curve in the path through a stand of trees, and suddenly it is there, intimate, unexpected, as if the landscape itself produced it for you alone. That is a fundamentally different emotional experience from anything available in the formal gardens of Versailles, where everything monumental is designed to be seen from far away, to announce itself, to reduce the viewer to appropriate smallness. The Petit Trianon was designed to make you feel like you had found something. Now here is where the story gets genuinely interesting and where I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever created a space, or found a space where the rules that applied everywhere else simply did not follow you inside, where the social performance, the professional persona, the careful management of how you are perceived, where all of that just could not find the door? Because that is what Marie Antoinette was attempting to engineer at the Petit Trianon, and she understood the engineering with considerable sophistication. One detail that I find endlessly fascinating is recorded in the accounts of the chateau's interior renovation. In her private salon at the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette had installed a device documented in the building records and in contemporary accounts, consisting of a set of mirrored panels that could be raised from the floor by a mechanical system to cover the windows entirely. These are described in various accounts as sliding shutters or rising mirrors. Their function was to make the room completely opaque from the outside. When the panels were raised, no one standing in the garden could see into the salon. No one passing could observe who was inside, what they were doing, or with whom. She had engineered privacy into the physical fabric of the building. In a court where visibility was, as we have discussed, the fundamental currency of power, where to be unseen was to cease to matter, she had built herself a room that at the press of a mechanism became invisible. I find that detail remarkable. Not as a scandal, there is nothing scandalous about wanting privacy, but as evidence of the length to which a person will go when privacy is systematically denied to them. When the need for it is great enough, you build the mechanisms for it yourself. The second phase of the transformation, beginning in 1783, was the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet. This is the element of the Petit Trianon that has generated the most controversy, the most misunderstanding, and the most persistent mythology. The Hameau was a small village, 12 buildings in total arranged around an artificial lake, in the northern part of the estate designed to resemble a working Norman farming community. Thatched roofs, half-timbered walls, a working dairy, a barn, a farmhouse, a mill with a wheel that was in the documented records entirely decorative. The standard narrative about the hameau, the one that was used against Marie Antoinette in pamphlets and revolutionary rhetoric during her lifetime, and that has persisted in various forms ever since, is that she was playing at being a peasant, that she was dressing up in simple clothes and pretending to be something she was not while the real peasants of France starved. This narrative is, by the evidence of the historical record, substantially false, and the falseness of it is actually more interesting than the myth. Marie Antoinette and her circle did not play at being peasants in the hameau. The historical accounts are consistent on this point. They used the hamlet's buildings as intimate gathering spaces, rooms for small suppers, for private conversation, for the kind of company that was impossible in the great salons of Versailles. The farm was a real working farm with real animals and real agricultural production, managed by a real farmer named Valley Boussard, who Marie Antoinette employed and corresponded with about practical agricultural questions. She hired a team of gardeners, a rat-catcher, which I mention partly because it is charming, and partly because it tells you this was a genuine working estate, rather than a decorative stage set and various labourers who maintained the grounds year-round. What she was building at the hameau was not a fantasy of poverty. It was a model of a different kind of life, a life organised around smallness rather than grandeur, around intimacy rather than spectacle, around the rhythms of seasons and growth rather than the rhythms of court protocol. She was imagining in architectural form what it might feel like to live as a private person. One further element of the Petit Trianon deserves attention because it speaks to something specific about Marie Antoinette that the standard histories tend to flatten. The Queen's Theatre, completed in 1780, was a small private theatre built within the estate. It was, and this is documented, the only building in the entire Trianon complex to survive fully intact and unchanged from Marie Antoinette's time to the present day. She used it to stage private theatrical performances, small productions for a selected audience of friends and intimates, and she did not merely watch, she performed. There are contemporary accounts of Marie Antoinette on the stage of her private theatre, acting in comedies and light operas, singing, moving through scenes with what observers described as genuine theatrical presence. Think about that for a moment. Here was a woman whose entire public life was in the most literal sense a performance, who had been performing the role of Queen of France every waking hour for years, in a court that understood itself as theatrical to its core, and her form of escape in her private garden was to perform again, but this time on her own terms, in a role she'd chosen, for an audience she had invited. The difference between a performance imposed and a performance chosen is, it turns out, the entire difference between a prison and a stage. The cruelty of what came next is not something I want to rush past, because the Petit Trianon, the space Marie Antoinette had built so carefully as her refuge, became, in the decade before the Revolution, the primary evidence used against her in the court of public opinion. The pamphlets and broadsides that circulated through Paris in the 1780s did not attack her for what happened in the palace. They attacked her for what happened at the Trianon, the privacy she had engineered, the sliding mirrors, the restricted access, the small gatherings from which most courtiers were excluded, became in the public imagination evidence of secrets, of betrayals, of a foreign queen hiding incomprehensible things behind walls that true French citizens could not breach. The garden she had built to be unseen in became the lens through which everyone decided to look at her. The refuge became the indictment. She had wanted only a corner of her life that belonged to her, and that corner in the end was used to define everything that her enemies wanted her to be. It is a kind of devastation that has a particular shape, one that I suspect some of you recognize, at least in smaller versions. The thing you build to protect yourself, becoming the thing used to condemn you. The private space violated and reinterpreted by people who were never meant to see inside it. The attempt at just being yourself in one small corner of your life, being read as evidence of everything you are not. But the story of Marie Antoinette's garden is not finished yet. Because in the very garden she built for peace in the Queen's Grove, a few hundred meters from the Petit Trianon, something happened in 1784 that set in motion a chain of events so dramatic, so operatic in its absurdity, and so genuinely consequential that historians still argue about its effects. A cardinal, a con artist, a necklace worth the equivalent of millions of dollars, and a meeting in the garden at night between a man who desperately wanted to regain the Queen's favour and a woman who was not the Queen at all. The affair of the diamond necklace. And the garden once again was where the story broke. Scandal as a historical force operates differently from war or politics or economics. It does not need to be true to be effective. It does not need to be fair. It does not even need to be coherent. It needs only to be vivid to be repeatable, and to land on ground that has already been prepared for it. And few pieces of ground in 18th century European history were more thoroughly prepared than the reputation of Marie Antoinette in the 1780s. She'd been a target of printed gossip since her arrival in France as a teenager. The pamphlets, some merely mocking, some genuinely vicious, had been circulating for years. Her nationality made her foreign. Her youth had made her seem frivolous. Her spending, which was real, had been enormously exaggerated. Her management of access to the Petit Trianon, her preference for a small circle of trusted friends, over the broad theatrical court she was expected to perform for all of this, had been quietly building into a portrait of a queen who was at best indifferent to France, and at worst actively hostile to it. All of that was the prepared ground. The affair of the diamond necklace was the spark, and it began as so many catastrophic things begin with a misunderstanding in a garden. To understand the affair you need to meet three people. The first is Cardinal Louis-René Edouard de Rohan, Prince of the Holy Roman Empire, Grand Almoner of France, one of the most prestigious ecclesiastical figures in the country, and a man who had, through a series of diplomatic missteps in Vienna, managed to make himself deeply unpopular with Marie Antoinette. She had not forgiven him. He knew she had not forgiven him. And for a man of his position and ambition living at Versailles, under the evident disfavour of the Queen, was an intolerable condition. He desperately wanted to be restored to her good graces. The second person is Jeanne de la Motte Valois, a woman of genuine intelligence and extraordinary audacity, who claimed descent from a legitimised line of the Valois royal family, and who had attached herself to the fringes of Versailles society, while nursing a set of grievances about her family's neglected claims and a talent for manipulation that was by any historical assessment remarkable. She convinced Cardinal de Rohan that she was a close personal friend of the Queen, that she had access to the Petit Trianon, that she could, if properly motivated, smooth the path to his restoration in royal favour. He believed her, partly because he wanted to, partly because she was very convincing. And so began one of the most elaborate confidence schemes in the history of European courts. The centrepiece of the affair was a necklace, not just any necklace. The court jewellers Boehmer and Bassange had spent years assembling what they intended to be the most spectacular piece of jewellery in Europe, a collar of 540 diamonds arranged in cascading rows and elaborate festoons so heavy that it reportedly required both hands to lift. The total cost 1,600,000 livres. To give that number some texture, the annual salary of a reasonably prosperous French artisan in the 1780s was somewhere between 200 and 300 livres. The necklace cost more than the annual income of 5,000 working families combined. Baume and Bassange had originally designed it for Madame du Barry, the mistress of Louis XV. She died before it could be completed. They then attempted to sell it to Marie Antoinette, who declined it, a fact that history has recorded clearly, but that the subsequent scandal almost entirely obscured. She did not want the necklace. She had said so multiple times. Jeanne de la Motte saw the necklace as an opportunity. What she constructed was breathtaking in its complexity. She told Cardinal de Rohan that the Queen secretly did want the necklace, that she simply could not be seen to purchase it publicly, given the climate of criticism about royal spending. She needed an intermediary, someone trusted, someone